found reflection, as this is one of the biggest humanitarian crisis, and our incapacity to address this crisis adequately constitutes a blight in our conscience. From escalation to the conflict has been claiming more lives. It has been causing more displacement. It has been causing more displacement. And it has been inflicting widespread destruction and indiscriminate destruction of civilian infrastructure. In short, an immense and horrendous tragedy has befallen the people of Gaza. Has befallen the people of Gaza with no end in sight. We note in that regard, the degree of insecurity, also impacts directly, and negatively on the humanitarian assistance, as it hinders safe mobility of humanitarian workers on the ground. The reconstruction of Gaza is a critical and urgent task. Especially after 11 months of intensive conflict and destruction. But we are also conscious of the fact that the current reconstruction of Gaza is a challenging undertaking. The conflict poses a permanent any reconstruction residences, hospitals, health works, places of refuge, of war and destruction. We can hardly speak of reconstruction under these circumstances. As council members, we shoulder the obligation and the responsibility to change the course of events. We must continue to work for the cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire. They are an urgent imperative for peace in Gaza and in the region. Only this option can pave the way for a sustainable plan of reconstruction. As it is clear that a reconstruction without peace cannot be viable. Mr. President, the recent humanitarian pause that has allowed for polio children constitutes a clear indication that ceasefire and peace are possible if the warring parties have the political will to follow the path of mutual accommodation and peace. This is the reason why we place our hopes in and encouragement for the diplomatic efforts by the United States of America, Egypt, Qatar, and other countries in the region, aimed at finding a negotiated solution leading to a permanent ceasefire. Mozambique wishes once again to underscore that the vision of a two-state solution, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and security, as full members of the United Nations, must continue to guide our collective efforts. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Mozambique for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the United States.
Thank you, Mr. President. And thank you, Senior Coordinator Cog and Director Maria de Silva, for your sobering briefings. And I also thank you for all of your efforts to get assistance to the Palestinian people in Gaza. At the outset, let me reiterate my outrage and President Biden's outrage at the death of Asinir Agi, an American citizen shot and killed in the West Bank last week. No one should have to put their life at risk simply for attending a protest, for freely expressing their views. This horrific tragedy should never have happened. We will continue to demand details and continue to demand access into Israel's investigation and press for accountability regarding the circumstances that led to Asinir's death. I also offer my sincere and heartfelt condolences to Asinir's family and friends. Her death, like that of so many others over the past year, was tragic and unnecessary. We must not grow numb to human suffering, no matter who and where it occurs. Colleagues, notwithstanding the efforts of Senior Coordinator Cog, her UN colleagues, and humanitarians on the ground, the situation in Gaza remains catastrophic. Children are dying, suffering from preventable illnesses, missing schools. Thousands have lost parents, relatives, teachers, and friends, and have the physical and psychological scars to show for it. In recent weeks, there have also been numerous attacks in which UN personnel and humanitarian workers have been injured or killed. We offer our deepest condolences to the families of UN personnel killed and recognize the tragic and unprecedented toll this conflict has taken on the UN family. Colleagues, many of these incidents were preventable. We will continue to raise the need for Israel to facilitate humanitarian operations and protect humanitarian workers and facilities, such as the UNRWA school targeted by the IDF last week in Nasrat. We have also been unequivocal in communicating to Israel that there is no basis, absolutely none, for its forces to be opening fire on clearly marked UN vehicles, as recently occurred on numerous occasions. The IDF is a professional military and knows well how to ensure that incidents such as these do not happen. And so the United States expects the IDF's leadership will implement fundamental changes in the way the IDF operate, including changes to their rules of engagement and steps to fix the obvious shortcomings in how the deconfliction procedures are implemented. At the same time, we continue to see Hamas hiding in and taking over and otherwise using civilian sites to conduct operations and pose an ongoing threat. There's no clear evidence of Hamas's total indifference to Palestinian civilians in Gaza. For their sake and the sake of innocent people on all sides of this conflict, this must stop. All sides to the conflict must adhere to their obligations under international humanitarian law to protect civilians. Colleagues, these recent incidents underscore once again the urgency of reaching a ceasefire with a release of hostages, as this Council called for in Resolution 2735. That is the best way to ensure humanitarians can safely and effectively carry out their life-saving work and massively increase the flow of humanitarian assistance to those who desperately need it. Until such a ceasefire is reached, we continue to work hard toward that end. It is vital that Israel cooperate with the UN to improve humanitarian access and humanitarian conditions generally. Palestinian civilians in Gaza have endured far too much suffering. We're pleased that the first round of polio vaccinations in Gaza has been largely successful, reaching 90% of its target population. and we commend the humanitarian community and all participating UN agencies for their life-saving work, and we thank them for their commitment and their sacrifice. We also encourage the continued cooperation between Israel and the humanitarian community to make this campaign happen. This level of cooperation should be the norm, not the exception. Indeed, the polio campaign is evidence that this can be done, that life-saving assistance can get to those in need without undercutting Israel's security. And so we call on Israel to invest just as much energy into the broader humanitarian effort in Gaza as it did for this first round of this vaccination campaign. Colleagues, 3 weeks from today, we will make a grim milestone, 1 year since Hamas's barbaric October 7th attack. 1 year since 1,200 citizens from Israel and many other countries were massacred, and hundreds more taken into the tunnels beneath Gaza, where many still wait in captivity today. They must be released immediately to their families. And 1 year since the civilians of Gaza first began to bear the brunt of a terrible conflict set in motion by Hamas. It bears repeating that it is manifestly in the interest of Israelis, Palestinians, and civilians in every country in the region for this desperation and this devastation to end, for there to be a ceasefire. We continue to work with Egypt and Qatar to find a way forward in the negotiations that will be acceptable to both parties. But as hard as we're going to work on texts and creative formulas, this is ultimately a question of political will. Whether or not leaders on both sides are prepared to recognize that enough is enough, and that the time has come to make some hard choices and some difficult compromises to end this carnage. We urge all council members with influence over Hamas to join others in pressing its leaders to stop stalling, make these compromises, and accept the deal without delay. Lives depend on it. The future depends on it. Colleagues, we remain committed to a two-state solution that will allow Israelis and Palestinians to live side by side in peace and security. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United States for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Guyana.
Thank you, Mr. President. At the outset, I wish to thank you for organizing today's briefing, and I express appreciation to Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag for her update on the implementation of the mandate given her in Resolution 2720. I also thank Under Secretary General Jorge Moreira da Silva for his briefing. Mr. President, the operating environment in Gaza has become extremely challenging and dangerous, primarily owing to the grave security situation. Humanitarian actors and UN personnel who continue to operate in Gaza do so at serious personal risk, as we have seen time and time again, including with the recent attack on the Al-Nusrat refugee camp, where 6 UNRWA staff were killed. Indeed, this war is the deadliest for the United Nations, with 224 UN personnel senselessly killed. Guyana therefore applauds the unselfish and unflinching decision of those who press on in these unfathomable circumstances. It is unfortunate that the parties have to be continuously reminded of their obligations under international humanitarian law to ensure the protection of humanitarian actors. These appeals have been to no avail, as evidenced by the continuing non-functioning of deconfliction and coordination mechanisms and the direct attacks and intimidation that many of them face. This must stop now. Mr. President, having examined the Senior Coordinator's update on the implementation of Resolution 2720 as of 2nd September, one sees tiny threads of optimism interwoven throughout the report. We note, for example, that the senior coordinator has been able to engage the parties and other stakeholders at the highest political level, resulting in improved access, enhanced logistical capabilities, and the operationalization of the 2720 mechanism, inter alia. While we commend the incremental progress, Guyana remains deeply concerned by assessments which show that the humanitarian situation in Gaza remains extremely dire. We note, for example, that 96% of the population is facing acute food insecurity. Civilian infrastructure continues to be destroyed, with OCHA reporting significant damage increases since July, and that violence and obstruction continue to impede humanitarian aid workers' ability to support those in need. Most importantly, and foundational to all humanitarian efforts, a ceasefire appears to be elusive. Guyana believes that there will be a deal for a ceasefire only when there is sincere concern for the protection of civilians, including the persons taken hostage on 7th October. As of now, that concern is largely absent, despite narratives to the contrary. Mr. President, turning now to the reconstruction of the Gaza Strip. This will be a monumental task with heavy financial implications. But let us not forget that the destruction of Gaza is not because of a natural disaster. This is Israel's doing. We are all familiar with the consistent spate of military operations against the Gaza Strip by Israel prior to 7th of October, and the resulting destruction of civilian infrastructure. The pattern of financing and refinancing reconstruction in Gaza is unsustainable, and the international community, including this Council, must contemplate measures to end this cycle so that Palestinians are not left behind in the global quest for sustainable development. Guyana believes that the only viable reconstruction plan is one that includes a roadmap to the two-state solution with the relevant security guarantees. Against the foregoing, Mr. President, Guyana reiterates the following appeals. First, we call for an immediate and unconditional ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, for an end to all hostilities in the occupied West Bank, including East Jerusalem. Guyana is prepared to work with fellow Council members, both to mandate the permanent cessation of hostilities in the occupied Palestinian territories and to activate the relevant provisions of the Charter to ensure that this mandate is adhered to. Second, we call for the immediate and unconditional release of all persons taken hostage from Israel on 7th of October. We reiterate that the taking of hostages is a war crime. We also call for the release of Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons without charge. In both cases, persons have the right to be treated with dignity and respect, to be free from torture and other forms of ill treatment, and to be afforded humanitarian visits. Under no circumstances are they to be arbitrarily detained. Third, Guyana calls on Israel to comply with its obligations under international law, including the Geneva Conventions, and adhere to the demands of resolutions 2712, 2720, 2728, and 2735. We further demand Israel's compliance with all of the ICJ orders directed at it in response to its war in Gaza. Finally, Mr. President, we demand that the highest priority be given to the protection and preservation of civilians. This necessitates, inter alia, improved humanitarian access, proper functioning of deconfliction mechanisms, and the setting up of real safe zones for displaced persons. This war has gone on for far too long, and nothing justifies the horrors that have been perpetrated against innocent men, women, and children in the name of self-defense. Civilians of Gaza are not just casualties of war, but in fact, victims of a senseless ideology in which one party refused to see the other as he is, human beings desiring to live in peace and security. The Council must rescue the two-state solution because that is the only potent solution to the Palestinian question. I pray we all live to see it. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Guyana for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea. Oh, no. Apologies. I give the floor to the representative of the United Kingdom. Apologies.
Thank you. Thank you, President. And like others, I join you in thanking Senior Humanitarian and Reconstruction Coordinator Karg and Executive Director De Silva for your briefings. The UK strongly supports the UN's tireless efforts to scale up aid into Gaza and pays tribute to you and the whole UN community for your work under increasingly difficult circumstances. As you said, your briefing was sober and sombre. It couldn't be otherwise, describing an intolerable humanitarian situation in Gaza. As we've heard, over 41,000 people have now been killed, tens of thousands more are injured, 17,000 children are without parents, and 101 civilians remain hostage in Gaza, subject to horrific and inhumane conditions for almost a year. We remain concerned too about the risk of wider regional escalation. We condemn the Houthi attack over the weekend, and we reiterate our demand for an immediate ceasefire and for Hamas to release all hostages. President, we welcome the news that the first round of the UN's polio vaccine campaign in Gaza has now concluded, facilitated by Israel's implementation of agreed tactical pauses. Despite the challenges, including the attack on a UN vaccination convoy last week, this shows that deconfliction can work where there is a political will. So, first, we now need to see this capacity for deconfliction applied to the wider humanitarian operation. Israel has committed to flood Gaza with aid, but this has not materialized. This is unacceptable. Second, President, mass Israeli evacuation notices and the use of heavy weaponry mean that nowhere is safe in Gaza. We join the Secretary-General's call for compliance with international law, especially the principles of distinction, proportionality, and precaution in attacks. We are horrified by the further killing of aid workers. Just last week, as colleagues have said, we heard reports of 18 people, including 6 UNRWA staff members, as the Secretary-General reported, killed by an Israeli military strike on the Al Jaouni school turned shelter. In total, 300 aid workers have been killed in this conflict, and we repeat our condolences to their families and their loved ones. And we reiterate that humanitarian workers must be allowed to carry out their work safely. Third, the UK will continue to play a leading role in addressing this humanitarian crisis, including through our renewed funding for UNRWA and support for other aid agencies, providing life-saving relief as well as continued advocacy. Colleagues, we're all rightly focused on the immediate priority of securing a ceasefire and a hostage release deal, and we fully support US, Qatari and Egyptian efforts and call on both Israel and Hamas to take the deal on the table. But we must also consider what comes next. There will be an enormous task in helping those in Gaza to rebuild. Early recovery will include clearing unexploded ordnance and rubble and providing essential services. The rebuilding of Gaza must be accompanied by the rebuilding of hope. Hope for an end to this cycle of violence. hope for long-term peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. This can be achieved only with a two-state solution which affords Palestinians their inalienable right to self-determination alongside security for Israel. I thank you.
I thank the representative of the United Kingdom for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of the Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to thank Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Executive Director Moreira da Silva of UNOPS for their detailed and somber briefings. Mr. President, to begin with, my delegation commends the improvements achieved by Senior Coordinator Kaag and her team, including the implementation of the 2720 mechanism on the Cyprus Maritime Corridor through Ashdod Port and the Jordan Land Corridor. We also appreciate Ms. Kaag's office in contributing the massive polio vaccination campaign throughout Gaza. We hope that Senior Coordinator Kaag keeps updating the Security Council on the implementation of her mandate for humanitarian aid and reconstruction in Gaza, which is critical even after the current hostilities cease. While we once again condemn in the strongest terms the horrendous terrorist attacks by Hamas on October 7th, it is deeply regrettable that due to the continuing Israeli military operations targeting civilian and humanitarian infrastructure, the repeated evacuation orders, and the total breakdown of law and order, the delivery of humanitarian aid in Gaza has been seriously hampered. It is now clear that without a fundamental change in the political stance of the direct parties, the advancements in logistics cannot garner Resolution 2720's intended results. Under international humanitarian law, it is the legal obligation of the parties to this conflict to protect humanitarian workers and facilitate rapid and unimpeded passage of humanitarian relief for civilians. The dangerous incident at a checkpoint in Gaza on September 9th is unacceptable, where a UN convoy to deliver polio vaccines already approved by the IDF was held by gunpoint for more than 7 hours. We call on the parties to this conflict, especially Israel, to implement every measure to prevent similar incidents. Deconfliction and notification mechanisms must be respected. We are also deeply troubled once again by repeated Israeli airstrikes on civilian infrastructure, especially last week's attack on an UNRWA school, reportedly killing 18 people, including women and children, as well as 6 UNRWA staff members. We fully sympathize with the condemnation, frustration, and anger expressed by Secretary General Guterres in his recent statement. Mr. President, the massive polio vaccination campaign shows what is urgently needed to bring about humanitarian improvements in Gaza, an immediate ceasefire, or at least a temporary humanitarian pauses. This Council adopted Resolution 2735 3 months ago, calling upon parties to accept and implement the terms of the deal still on the table. It is profoundly disappointing that despite the ongoing pressure on Hamas to accept the deal and on Israel to stick to its conditions, we are not seeing a finalization of the agreement regarding an immediate ceasefire and release of hostages that would lead to a massive influx of humanitarian aid into Gaza. However, even before the finalization of the deal or implementation of the ceasefire, humanitarian aid must be expanded throughout Gaza. It is a miserable reality that since May, when the IDF began its operations in Rafah, the volume of humanitarian assistance into Gaza remains far below even the minimum needs of 2.3 million people, most of whom cannot afford commercial goods. Denial of so-called dual-use items by Israel must be fully explained, and the criteria must be transparent and reliable. As skin infections run rampant, we are deeply concerned that even basic hygiene items like soap are being denied entry into the Gaza Strip. Israel must demonstrate to the rest of the world that they are actually doing their best to facilitate humanitarian aid to Gazan people. Mr. President, I'd like to conclude my statement by reiterating a simple principle. All Security Council resolutions should be implemented without any delay, without any excuse. Both Hamas and Israel need to secure a ceasefire agreement, and this should serve as a starting point for a permanent ceasefire and critical reconstruction efforts, as Resolution 2735 provides for. Alongside the active participation of a reformed and strengthened Palestinian Authority with the long-term vision of the two-state solution. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Republic of Korea for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of China.
主席，我要感谢卡格高级协调员和 De Silva 执行主任的通报。
President, I thank Senior Coordinator Sigrid Kaag and Executive Director Moirara De Silva for their briefings. China commends the Senior Coordinator and humanitarian agencies for their efforts to expand humanitarian deliveries to Gaza since over 9 months ago. We support Ms. Kaag's continued reporting to the Security Council. As we have heard from the briefers, notwithstanding the 4 resolutions adopted by this Council, the ICJ orders on provisional measures and the Herculean efforts of UN and other humanitarian agencies, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has been steadily worsening, and violations of international law, in particular IHL, have persisted non-stop. Just last week, a UN convoy supporting the polio vaccination campaign approved by Israel was forcibly detained for nearly 8 hours, during which shots were fired. Also last week, 6 UNRWA employees were killed in an airstrike. China strongly condemns such appalling attacks on humanitarian agencies and personnel, which are unacceptable. UNRWA is mandated by the General Assembly to provide relief for Palestinian refugees and is a pillar of strength for humanitarian operations in Gaza. Even at the most perilous of times, the agency has not abandoned Gaza, and to date, 240 of its staff have perished in the line of duty. We salute the highest terms all the humanitarian workers who are still hanging in there and convey our deepest condolences over the demise of those who have made the ultimate sacrifice. We call on Israel to investigate in earnest all attacks on humanitarian workers and hold the perpetrators accountable. That the polio vaccination campaign could go ahead is a telling proof that where the parties show political will, scaling up the humanitarian operations in Gaza is perfectly achievable. China renews its call to Israel to fulfill its obligations under IHL by putting lives and humanity first, lift the blockade, open all crossings, scrap restrictions on humanitarian deliveries, cease and desist from attacking UN and other humanitarian agencies, and provide safe and unimpeded access to the operations of those agencies, and do so without delay. President, we are not far from the first anniversary of the conflict in Gaza. Over the past year, despite strong joint international calls for a ceasefire and the cessation of killings, Israel has not halted its military operations, which have led to over 41,000 deaths among Palestinian civilians. This is alarming. This is past belief. The Security Council has the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security, but why has it been unable to stop this human tragedy, the worst of its kind, to this day? As analyses point out, had the United States not stood in the way on all those occasions, the Council could have adopted a resolution demanding a ceasefire early on, after conflict erupted. Had the US not shielded one side time and again, multiple resolutions of this Council would not have been flagrantly rejected and defied. We urge the US to show a responsible attitude, use the significant influence it holds over the party, and take tangible action to prevail upon Israel to cease its military operations without delay, as demanded by the Council resolutions, to give the long-suffering Palestinian people a chance to live. China supports further action on the part of this Council to put out the flames of war, mitigate the humanitarian disaster, and bring peace to the region as soon as possible. Thank you, President.
I thank the representative of China for their statement. I give the floor to the representative of Ecuador.
Gracias.
Thank you. Mr. President, I'd like to thank Coordinator Cog and Director Moreira da Silva for their reports. At the same time, I renew my country's support for your work. Ecuador supports the efforts of the Coordinator's Office with all of the parties to work towards an opening and reopening of additional crossings into Gaza to guarantee an urgent increase in aid. And at the same time, we welcome efforts to ensure access to Gaza of critical humanitarian provisions for health, waste management, education, water supply, sanitation, and hygiene. By August 28th, the Coordinator's Office's efforts had facilitated the delivery of more than 27,000 tons of aid. Mechanism 2720 is operational. What is lacking is the political will to allow for the delivery of aid in the quantities needed in order to alleviate the appalling situation of the civilian population in Gaza. Colleagues, 11 months since the onset of the war have gone by, following the terrorist attacks perpetrated by Hamas, which Ecuador once again condemns. And it has been more than 8 months since the adoption during the Ecuadorian presidency of Resolution 2720, in which the Council called on the parties to allow, facilitate, and provide for the large-scale, immediate, safe, and unfettered delivery of humanitarian assistance to the civilian population in Gaza. Despite the efforts of the coordinator, her team, and other actors, it has still not been possible for humanitarian aid to be provided and distributed at the necessary scale and without any obstacles in order to guarantee access by the population in Gaza to food, water, sanitation, electricity, telecommunications, and medical services. Resolution 2720 also requires parties to adopt necessary measures to guarantee the safety of humanitarian personnel, to protect and respect humanitarian personnel as well. And unfortunately, we periodically receive reports showing that this requirement is not being met, despite its reiterated references to it in Resolution 2730. Once again, my country calls for a complete and immediate implementation of Resolution 2735, allowing for an immediate ceasefire, the release of hostages, and the delivery of sufficient aid to Gaza, as well as the safety of humanitarian personnel. Ecuador welcomes ongoing efforts to that end. Until that happens, we must ensure preparedness for a ceasefire by pre-positioning supplies and utilizing all aid routes into Gaza, creating an environment conducive to humanitarian work. My country welcomes and supports the activities of the Coordinator's Office to that end. Mr. President, I conclude my statement by appealing to all actors who are in a position to do so to contribute to the 2720 mechanism, and we thank countries who have already made a contribution. Humanitarian work is ongoing despite all the difficulties, and it is a ray of hope in the midst of war. Our collective duty is to support it. Thank you.
Representative of Ecuador for their statement. I shall now make a statement in my capacity as the representative of Slovenia. First, I want to thank Ms. Kag and Ms. Moreira da Silva for their work and for their briefings today. Colleagues, today I will focus on political will or lack of it. Both briefers spoke about it, and so did several members of the Council. Ms. Kag, you concluded your July briefing underlining that there is no substitute for political will and that there is no substitute for the full respect of international humanitarian law. And actually today you, as well as Mr. Moreira da Silva, you repeated that mechanism cannot substitute for the lack of political will. And indeed, today's briefing and humanitarian catastrophe on the ground unfortunately, continue to confirm that both have been in very short supply during the whole duration of this sad conflict. It confirms that nothing can replace the absence of political will of Israel to ease or help ease suffering of civilians in Gaza. In December 2023, this Council showed strong political will to alleviate humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza. It passed Resolution 2720, which mandated a mechanism and a senior coordinator with a focus on humanitarian aid and reconstruction of Gaza. 9 months later, the mechanism is operational, the coordinator has been committed, yet the main purpose of the resolution, the delivery of humanitarian aid at scale, has not been achieved for lack of political will and disrespect of the international humanitarian law. Corridors have been established and additional crossings open, yet some largely or completely non-operational, including Rafah. Obstacles, uncertainty, and unpredictability keep dictating delivery of aid. In Gaza, challenges continue to mount, from attacks on the conflicted shelters and convoys, evacuation orders, food insecurity, diseases, breakdown of law and order, to destruction of basic infrastructure. We condemn recent incidents, including the attack on UNRWA school turned shelter. We have to end this sense of impunity for lack of respect of international humanitarian law, as if civilians can be subjected to killing, maiming, bombing, torturing, displacement, starvation, under the eyes of the international community and the Security Council. This is unacceptable. There have been few glimmers of hope. We welcome medical evacuations, which took place last week, and the first round of polio vaccination campaign, which was carried out by WHO, UNICEF, and UNRWA with Israel's support. When there is a political will, civilian population can be protected and can be taken care of. This war has passed the limits of the conceivable of human suffering and of the international order we trust. Yet over 3 months since the adoption of Resolution 2735, we see absence of political will to implement it and to finalize the ceasefire deal. What is growing, I sense, is the political will in the Council to do more to ensure a ceasefire is implemented. We are approaching 7th of October, a year of this tragic conflict. This is not an opportunity, but a duty for the Security Council to show not only political will, but determination to help end it. It is time for the Security Council to ensure compliance with its resolutions. The way forward for us is a cascading approach to exert pressure to ensure ceasefire that holds, a rebuilding of life in Gaza from security, restarting education, health and psychosocial services to garbage collection, an immediate start of the time-bound political process and implementation of the two-state solution, and reconstruction of Gaza, which will unfortunately present a long-term project. The Palestinian government should be at the center of these efforts and plans. Political will of the international community to rebuild Gaza can only happen in parallel with the political will of Israel to engage in a political process leading to its security and mutual recognition. No other solutions of the situation in Palestine would be acceptable for the international community. Thank you. I resume my function as the President of the Council. I now give the floor to the representative of Israel.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, I would like to thank Ms. Kach and Mr. De Silva for their briefings. Mr. President, as we gather here once more to discuss the humanitarian situation in Gaza, I cannot help but reflect on the narrowness of these discussions. We speak, as if by habit, about aid deliveries, about food and medicine, and yet there is hardly a mention of the hostages, our people still held in captive in the most brutal conditions imaginable. The 6 hostages executed in cold blood, whose faces you all saw last time we gathered here, were kept in a tunnel whose entrance was hidden beneath a child's bedroom. We all must ask ourselves how much of the aid ends up fueling the very tunnels that imprison the innocent. How much, if any, of the aid reaches the hostages? How much is stolen by the Hamas terror machine, never reaching the Palestinians? Let me be clear. Israel's humanitarian efforts during the war are unparalleled for a country which underwent its most tragic day and has since been forced to go to war. We have gone above and beyond our obligations, aiming to improve the well-being of a civilian population embedded within the enemy. The statistics are there for all to see. While they differ from the terrorist supply statistics, we urge the Council and the UN to stick to the facts. Over 1 million tons of aid have been delivered via more than 50,000 trucks. There have been nearly 1 million land crossings, providing vital supplies and assistance to the people of Gaza. Hardly a fraction of the crossings have ever been stopped. 800,000 tons of food and aid have crossed into Gaza under Israeli coordination. We have also acted dynamically in response to the changing circumstances. The polio vaccination campaign, ran in collaboration with UNICEF and the WHO, is well underway. As of September 10, over 500,000 Gazan children had been vaccinated. We appreciate our partners at UNICEF and the WHO for their efforts. Despite the slander, the noise, the panic, we have clearly demonstrated our willingness to work with cooperative agencies, those who truly care about the welfare of civilians and wish to work meaningfully with us. The cooperation with UNICEF and the WHO has been productive. Together, we have responded to the needs of Gazans as they arise, adapting to the humanitarian situation in real time. We also value the ongoing cooperation with Senior Humanitarian Coordinator Kach and her team. But we must draw a line. We cannot work with everyone, and we will not work with those who do not care for civilians, but only care to harm Israel. UNRWA Gaza has become nothing more than a cartel, fostering hatred and prolonging misery in Gaza. UNRWA Gaza does not assist, it enables. It enables the very forces that keep Gaza in a state of despair. We have documented proof of UNRWA staff involved in the Hamas-led atrocities of October 7. Earlier this year, we provided more than 100 names and military IDs of terrorist operatives currently employed by UNRWA in Gaza to Commissioner Lazzarini. This list is part of an ongoing process and does not yet reveal the full extent of the infiltration of UNRWA Gaza. Yet, some here continue to fund this organization as if it were neutral, as if it were part of the solution and not part of the problem. Just last week, as many of you mentioned earlier, on Wednesday, September 11th, our forces conducted a strike on terrorists operating inside a building which was once a school. After we were accused by few dignitaries of killing local UNRWA workers in the strike, the IDF requested that the agency provide details and names of the workers so we may review the claim, as any liberal democracy would do. Until now, no answers have been provided by UNRWA despite repeated requests. However, we have confirmed several terrorists who were eliminated in the strike. These terrorists included Muhammad Adnan Abu Zayad, Yasser Ibrahim Abu Sarar, and Ayad Matar. Each of these terrorists were Hamas military operatives. Each of them was also employed by UNRWA. They have a day job with UNRWA and a night job with Hamas. Colleagues, the most effective way to improve the humanitarian situation is clear: the removal and dismantlement of the Hamas terror organization, the cause of the suffering, the monsters who bear sole responsibility. Defeating Hamas will allow the people of Gaza to shape their own future and rebuild their lives, working alongside the most successful and prosperous nations in the region. Let me be clear, with Hamas left in control, no meaningful discussion can take place about Gaza's future, not about its governance, its reconstruction, or its prospects. The root of the humanitarian crisis in Gaza is not a shortage of food or medicine. It is that Hamas continues to hold its people hostage in service of their evil ideology. Our goal is very clear: to defeat Hamas, to secure the return of all our hostages, and to allow Gazans to take control of their own future, free from the grip of terror, free from the incitement and hatred that has poisoned their society for too long. Once Hamas is gone, we want the people of Gaza to administer their own affairs, to rebuild their lives with dignity and in peace, alongside their Israeli neighbors. As long as Hamas rules Gaza with its hateful ideology, the people there will never have a chance at a decent life. As long as Hamas holds our citizens hostage, as our families wonder if their loved ones are dead or alive, the real humanitarian work cannot begin. It is time for this Council to acknowledge the truth. The humanitarian crisis in Gaza isn't due to a lack of food or medicine. It stems from lack of genuine leadership, poor management, and the grip of a terror organization that values death over life. The defeat of Hamas is not just an Israeli interest, it is a humanitarian imperative. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Israel for their statement. There are no more names inscribed on the list of speakers. I now invite Council members to informal consultations to continue our discussions on the subject. The meeting is adjourned.